want to welcome you to our talk tonight, Under His Voice, The Life and Local Legacy of Chaplain Henry Vinton Plummer. This lecture tonight is part of a series of lectures, and the series of lectures is in turn a part of a larger series of lectures, concerts, dance performances, films, all kinds of arts and humanities activities under the rubric We Are Tacoma. And if you're interested, which I hope you are, in other of our activities this next few months, this pamphlet is available right outside the door. So pick one up as you leave. We have a poetry reading the third Thursday of every month. The lectures are usually the first Monday. Films the first Thursday. Films the second Thursday, and this also mentions a number of other exhibits on even Saturdays. I also want to call your attention to the table in the back, which has some surveys that we're hoping that those of you who came tonight will fill out. The purpose, I have to confess that I'm getting pretty grumpy at all of the surveys that people are asking me to do. Every time I talk to someone on the phone, I'm supposed to have to fill out a survey. Every time I buy something, I'm supposed to fill out a survey. So I'm getting pretty grumpy about surveys, but I want to give you a sense of why we have this survey, and that's that Tacoma Park is unusual in cities of this size in having a cultural plan. And the cultural plan we have was developed, I think, 13 years ago. It's quite old. And we've actually achieved a lot of what the cultural plan set out to do. So we're sort of, the Arts and Humanities Commission is sort of going into its next iteration of cultural plan. We're going to do cultural plan 2. And for part of that, we want to know what people want. And unfortunately, the only way we can do that is to ask. And the way we're asking is through this survey. So we have these surveys on the back table. They can also be done online, and also on the table you'll find a little card with the website if you prefer to do it online. But I really hope, and the other members of the commission who are here tonight, all share in this hope that you will help us to help you and bring you more great programming. So our talk tonight, Under His Voice, The Life and Local Legacy of Chaplain Henry Vinton Plummer, is being presented by 2 lecturers. One of them is the Reverend L. Jerome Fowler. He is a descendant of the Plumbers, and he tells me he has studied them all of his life. Since he was 7 years old, and he promises to tell us the story of how he learned about them when he was 7 years old. The other lecturer is Dr. Leigh Ryan. She's the director of the Writing Center at the University of Maryland English Department in College Park. So please join me in welcoming them. Go first.
Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to be here this evening and to share with you. Let me tell you where I came from. As Susan has told you, I am Jerome Fowler. I am the son of Fay and Linwood Fowler. My mother is the daughter of Robert and Florence Plummer. My grandfather is the son of Nicholas Saunders and Fanny Plummer. My great-grandfather is the son of Adam Francis and Emily Plummer. My great-great-grandfather is the son of William Barney and Sally Plummer. My great-great-great-great-grandfather is the son of Cupid and Millie. who were slaves on the Plummer farm, which was owned by a young lady by the name of Jemima Plummer, who later in life married a Jack Hodge. That farm was located southeast of Upper Marlboro, the Prince George's County seat, off of Route 4. If you ever traveled along Route 4 on your way to Deal or points beyond, you might have noticed a sign that said Plummer Lane. That indicates the lane that led to where that farm was located. Cupid Plummer, we believe, and his brother were brought over from Africa in the early to mid 1700s. And they were bought by Jemima Plummer, who, as I said, was a Quaker. And she was very good to her slaves because the Quakers did not support the idea or the institution of slavery. But she needed them to work for her and to cultivate her farm. When the American Revolutionary War broke out after the colonies claimed independence from England, we did not have an army. And so each colony had what they called a voluntary militia. And the slave owners were allowed to send their slaves to fight in the Continental Army in their stead. We know that Obadiah and Cupid were sent. They served 7 years in the Continental Army, and when they returned as free men. Now, I don't know what happened to Uncle Obadiah, what he did, but I know that my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Cupid, did not leave his wife and family behind because they were not subject to freedom. They remained in servitude. And he stayed at that farm, as far as we know, for the rest of his life with his wife. His sons went on. He had two sons, Adam and Barney, William Barney. Adam, I think, was sold to a family in Montgomery County. He eventually ended up in southwest Washington after the Civil War, where he died. The other son, William Barney, became the property and was owned by George H. Calvert, who was the grandson of the 5th Lord Baltimore during colonial period in Maryland. And it goes down that William Barney married he lived at Calvert's estate on Goodwood, which was off of what we now know as Route 301, north of Upper Marlboro. And he married a girl there, and they remained there for the rest of their lives at Goodwood. They had 8 children. 8 children, 3 boys and 5 girls. Adam was the youngest of the 3 boys, and he was next to the youngest child. And interestingly, I'll have to tell you that about that later, how we have our history. I promise to tell you that. But during his lifetime, Adam Plummer did some unusual things. He set some very strong examples for his children to follow. And as we go into our story about Chaplain Henry Vinton Plummer, who was their second child, we have to relate to the other children, their oldest daughter, Sarah Miranda, and the youngest of the 9 children, who were twins, Nellie and Robert. But that gives you an insight as to what we're going to talk about tonight. And I hope I can keep your interest. Thank you. Leigh?
Okay. Riversdale House Museum is really our connection. The house, it's in Riverdale Park. You can go visit it now, tour it. Both of us have been volunteers there. I think I've been volunteering there almost 20 years now. And I teach a course at Maryland on women in the plantation household. And I use a book that is connected to this house in that class. This house was built between 1801 and 1807. It was started by Henry Steer, who had come here in 1794 from Belgium. He brought his family with him, escaping Napoleon. They came to Philadelphia, so we have Henri and Marie, their two older children who were both married, Charles and Isabel, and their youngest daughter, Rosalie. Rosalie at the time was 16. Eventually, she met and married George Calvert, the descendant of the Lords Baltimore. They had two children. Her father started building Riversdale, and the family decided that they would return to Belgium. Napoleon had granted amnesty to people who had fled, and Marie really, his wife, had never really learned English. She wasn't very comfortable here. So Henri and Marie and the two older children and their families, Charles and Isabel and their families, all returned, leaving Rosalie here, married to George Calvert, and they got to finish building this house. What this resulted in is a book called Mistress of Riversdale. So we are very, very fortunate at this plantation home because we have a story, and most plantation homes do not. We know because we have 20 years worth of letters back and forth between Rosalie, her parents, her brother, her sister. They are a delight to read. She's very gossipy with her sister. She writes about Betsy Bonaparte, who was in Baltimore, turning up at a party in a transparent dress. She's very playful she's the playful younger sister with her brother. She handles a lot of business transactions for her father, but we do indeed have this wonderful story. We know that we had a couch with blue stripes, and most houses do not know that. But in addition, we are fortunate to have Adam Francis Plummer's story. Adam is brought to Riversdale when he's 10 years old. In 1829, he's brought from Goodwood, a hunting lodge owned by the Calverts. He is enslaved there. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. He actually becomes the personal slave to Charles Benedict Calvert, who founded the University of Maryland. So there's a real connection there. And those two were apparently very, very close, very devoted to one another, trusted one another implicitly. Anyway, Adam ends up meeting Emily. Emily comes from Three Sisters Plantation, about 8 miles away, and she happens to come with her mother to visit an aunt. This aunt was married to a slave at Riversdale, and she had come to visit her husband, had gotten sick, and so here come Emily and her mom to visit, and Emily meets Adam. 2 years later, they get married. They marry on May 31st, 1841. It's very interesting because Adam had also secretly learned to read and write from an itinerant Methodist minister, John Bowser. And on the day that he married Emily, he began to keep a journal. And this in the middle is the journal that he kept. That journal, by the way, disappeared. The family had no idea where it was. And through circumstances, it was found in 2003 and donated to the Anacostia Museum, which is part of the Smithsonian. So that's where it is now. The other book, Out of the Depths or The Triumph of the Cross, Jerome mentioned that Adam and Emily's youngest child, the youngest two were twins, Nellie and Robert. But Nellie decided in 1927, I think, to publish a memoir and sort of a spiritual biography. It's a very interesting book. It's very difficult to read because it's rather disjointed, but it's got a lot of the family stories, and her real purpose in telling it was so that these could be written down, so that people could learn from the ways in which her parents and her brothers and sisters, particularly her two oldest sister and brother, Sarah Miranda and Henry Vinton Plummer, had conducted themselves throughout their lives. So we have all of these stories, and what it gives us at Riversdale is a real piece of what went on there. All right, so who is Henry Vinton Plummer? He ends up becoming the first African-American chaplain in the U.S. regular Army. In 1866, when the Civil War ended, Congress set up 6 black regiments, 4 that were infantry and 2 that were cavalry, the 9th and 10th. And Henry decided that he wanted to be a chaplain, and he applied. He actually spent several years applying. And finally, President Chester Arthur did appoint him to be a chaplain in the regular Army. And we always kind of have to add that regular Army piece, because there had been chaplains who were parts of the volunteer Army before that. But this is the first one appointed to the regular Army. All right. Sadly, well, he's worth learning about for a lot of good reasons. For one thing, he's really quite the activist, as you'll see. He's the kind of person who sees things that need to be done, and instead of looking around and just saying, well, somebody ought to do something, he's the one who steps up and does something. So we'll spend a little bit of time tonight looking at what he contributes to local African American history and what he contributes to the U.S. Army military history. Now, I have a short video to show you next, but I need to kind of set the stage a little bit for that. Henry served for 10 years in the Army, and I think because he was such an activist, he ended up annoying the white command, which is probably putting it mildly, and in 1894, he was dishonorably discharged. They really kind of looked for a reason to get rid of him, and they found one. He moved with his family to Kansas City, and the story sort of died away. People in families didn't talk about unpleasant things. And in fact, if you look at Nellie's book, she'll say when Uncle Henry was dismissed or left the Army, that kind of thing. So the story sort of dies away and resurfaces about 100 years later when somebody visits the church that Jerome is at and starts talking a little bit about Henry Vinton Plummer, and Jerome says, what are you talking about? And eventually that led to getting a transcript of the court-martial, which is right over here in archives too. So it's in the backyard, really. And forming a committee, the Committee to Clear Chaplain Plummer. We began that with a group of, oh my gosh, military people, politicians, friends, family members. It took us years, literally years, to do the research. Jerome and I traveled out to Kansas, to Nebraska to do research out there because that's where he had been serving in the Army. We ended up putting together a report that's about that thick, seriously. And when we started, we had no idea who you even go to say, could you please change a dishonorable discharge to honorable? We found out there's an Army board for that. So this video is actually one that we found a plumber who this is his field. He makes videos, he makes movies. And at any rate, he put together a 6-minute one for us that gives you sort of the history of Henry Vinton Plummer. Now let's see if we can get this to go. Thank you.
Henry Vinton Plummer was born into slavery on July 31st, 1844. His parents, Adam Francis Plummer and Emily Saunders Plummer, lived at 2 separate Maryland plantations, Riversdale, and 3 sisters, both located in Prince George's County. Sold with his mother in 1851, he then lived in Meridian Hill, Washington, D.C., and later Ellicott Mills, Maryland. In the spring of 1862, Henry escaped and made his way back to Riversdale. where his father kept him hidden until he could get to an aunt's home in Washington, D.C. When the opportunity presented itself, Henry enlisted in the U.S. Navy and served the Union in the Civil War until his honorable discharge in 1865. A freed man, he returned to Riversdale to live with his parents and siblings. In 1866, his parents sent him to New Orleans to search for his sister, Sarah Miranda, who had been sold there as a slave in 1860.
All he had to go on was a letter. He arrived early on Sunday morning, dressed in his Navy uniform, which he wore with pride and dignity. He began to search the streets, looking for a particular address. Found the street for which he was searching and found his sister. He immediately packed her up, and by midweek they were returning to Washington, D.C., and ultimately to the Riversdale plantation on which his parents lived. That Friday night, October 19th, in a family prayer meeting, the church that we dearly love today, the St. Paul Baptist Church, was born.
Henry received his pastoral training at the Wayland Seminary in Washington, D.C., while working as a night watchman at the D.C. Post Office. After graduating, he became the third pastor of the St. Paul's Baptist Church in 1876.
As he finished his sermon, his mother rose from her seat, went to him and took his hand, saying, "Son, you have preached my funeral sermon. To think that God has elevated you to the pulpit, and I have sat under your voice today." 16 days later, she succumbed to pneumonia and breathed her last.
Desiring to serve the United States Army as a chaplain, Henry applied, supported by letters of recommendations from Frederick Douglass and others.
He wrote a letter of recommendation for Plummer to be appointed chaplain and continued to support him throughout his trials and travail.
President Chester Arthur appointed him chaplain of the 9th U.S. Cavalry in July 1884. Henry Vinton Plummer became the first African American to be appointed as a United States Army chaplain in the regular Army. He held a rank equivalent to captain. After 10 years of dutiful service, which included being stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas, and Fort McKinney, Wyoming, the chaplain became the focus of an alleged incident in June 1894 while stationed at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. This alleged incident resulted in a charge of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. A general court-martial was convened at Fort Robinson, Nebraska on August 27, 1894, for the trial of Chaplain Henry Vinton Plummer, 9th Cavalry, U.S. Army. One specification accused him of furnishing liquor to enlisted men and drinking with them. A second accused him of behaving in an unbecoming manner and using intemperate and vulgar language towards an enlisted man in the presence of the man's wife. There were 7 witnesses for the prosecution and 12 witnesses for the defense. Chaplain Plummer testified in his own behalf and pled not guilty to the charge and specifications. On September 7, 1894, the court found Chaplain Plummer guilty of the charge and all specifications and sentenced him to be dismissed from the service of the United States. The court-martial was reviewed through military channels, and Major General J.M. Schofield, the commanding general, recommended that the sentence be commuted to suspension of half pay for 1 year. President Grover Cleveland, however, approved the record, proceedings, and sentence. The Secretary of War directed the sentence to take place on November 10, 1894. 2 days later, Chaplain Plummer wrote an appeal to President Grover Cleveland. His request was denied. Plummer continued to write appeals for reinstatement, citing false testimony and prejudice as reasons for his dismissal. He maintained his innocence until his death on February 10, 1905.
Now, I'm not sure where to click to get out of here. It doesn't work this way on my computer. All right, thank you. Okay. All right. We formed the committee to clear Chaplain Plummer in 2001. It took until February, well, we turned everything in, I think in 2004, complete with a signing with Governor Ehrlich and Michael Steele and so on. We went up to Annapolis to do that. It was really quite interesting. They presented us to the state legislature before, really interesting. It took the Army Board for the Correction of Military Records about a little more than a year, I believe, to come to the conclusion that it should be an honorable discharge. And so that's what they changed it to restore equity. And then that summer on July 1st, the Army presented this honorable discharge to family members and dedicated a new headstone at National Harmony Memorial Park. All right. Henry Vinton Plummer, if you kind of look at what is important to him, I mentioned that he is an activist. Very, very important to him were his faith and his church. He went to Wayland Seminary. He ended up pastoring several churches in this area, several missions. There were times when he was actually working between two churches, going from one to the other. He pastored the church that his sister had founded, and by the way, that's the church that Jerome is at now, too. So it really has stayed in the family. Family was very, very important. He comes from a very, very close family. In fact, that was one of the really awful things for his mother at one point when they're fairly young. The children are young. I think she has 5 when they are actually sold and moved to Meridian Hill. But Emily's father was sold. Emily had a brother, and then her father was sold, and they never found out where he was sold to or heard from him again. Her mother remarried and had 23 children. So Emily comes out of 3 sisters with a very, very large and close family. And all of this importance of family is very much passed on to Henry. Freedom is very important to him. He is clearly very, very unhappy. At one point, his mother gives birth. When his mother gives birth to the twins, she hears Henry outside of her window crying, and she calls him in. She thinks the master has beaten him. And she says, "Why are you crying?" And he says, "How could you possibly keep bringing children into this life, into slavery?" Emily's answer is that these children will become a teacher. The girl will become a teacher. The man will become a doctor. And indeed, Nellie does become a teacher. Robert becomes a pharmacist. But Henry does finally escape. And he also has a very, very strong work ethic. We know that he was very involved in education, particularly throughout PG County. In Prince George's County, we find evidence from what his sister has written. A lot of his friends were teachers. We have evidence of him appearing before the school board, trying to make sure that all children receive an equal education. Now, all right. People of accomplishment rarely sat back and let things happen to them. They went out and happened to things. And I think that quotation really just perfectly captures this man. It was very interesting when we had the committee together. I was because I'm the English teacher, I ended up being the writer for a lot of what we did. We found lawyers who worked with us pro bono, but we were told we had to do the work. And we did. And I used to go and get Henry's picture and put it near me and say, "All right, inspire me, tell me what I should be saying for you. How should I argue this?" All right, he's born at Three Sisters Plantation, which is owned by Sarah Ogle Hillary. It's where Flowers High School is now in Prince George's County in Lanham. Beg your pardon? Flowers High School. Yeah. So anyway, this is Adam and Emily, And the Plummer family, they had 9 children, 8 of whom lived to adulthood. They got married on May 30th, 1841. Adam would walk the 8 miles from Riversdale to Three Sisters on Saturday, and then he had to be back on Monday morning to go to work. But what he did is he took very good care of his family. He made sure that they had furniture, they had chairs, not just 3-legged stools. We have a list, an inventory that was taken of her cabin, and I'll show you that in a moment. But there are things like wine glasses on there. He saved his money. One of the things that's in his diary is lists of what he spends money on and so on, and how he earns money besides working for Charles Benedict Calvert, who doesn't pay him, of course. But at any rate, we see that he took really, really good care of his family. In 1845, however, despite the fact that actually the owners of both Adam and Emily were fairly good, Adam and Emily decided that they were going to escape. When they got married at a church in Washington, D.C., which was very unusual. We don't know why. Slaves could not enter into a legal contract, and that was a legal contract. But they did do that. They got a wagon and went into D.C., went to the church, and said they wanted to get married, and learned that they had to get a license. And Adam went and paid $1 for the marriage license. But several years later, they decided they could use that license as free papers, because if they went north and they could show this would prove that they were not slaves. They did plan to escape. I'm astonished that they did. It would have been incredibly risky to go up the Underground Railroad, really, with 2 small children. Henry was barely a year old at this point, and Sarah was just a couple of years old, so they would have had really small children who could have cried and given them away very easily. Unfortunately, Adam had told Emily not to tell anybody of their plans, but for some reason she told a relative. And when they went looking for this marriage license where they had hidden it, it was gone. They never found it again, and that ended their escape attempt. Adam did not get punished. Emily did. Emily was demoted. She was a cook, which was a really good position to have in a household. Actually a fairly influential position. But she was demoted to being a field hand, and several times they wanted to put her up for sale, and things got changed because she had just had another baby, or she was sick, or something. Finally, though, Sarah Ogle Hillary dies, and Emily is sold with her children. It was absolutely awful. When you read the accounts of this, they ended up being sold to. Well, all right. That's Adam's house. There's Charles Benedict Calvert, and this is the catalog of things marked. I mean, she's got gilded pitchers and wine glasses and so on and so forth. But they are sold to Colonel Livingston Gilbert Thompson and Mary Ann Tolley Dorsey Thompson. It's really Mary Ann Tolley Dorsey Thompson's money that purchases them. Her father was Thomas Beale Dorsey from Howard County, a lawyer, a planter, and chief judge in the Maryland Court of Appeals from 1848 to 1851. The day that they were put up, that they were going to be put up for sale, of course, they were going to split the family up for one thing, and that was not very pleasant for Adam and Emily. But one of the things that was going to happen is that they were told that Henry would be sold to someone who was identified in Nellie's book simply as M, and then a line. They don't even tell you his name. But he was known for being very, very cruel, and Emily was simply beside herself. So she scooped up her child She ran a couple of miles away and she hit him in a corn shock. And she told him, "You may not come out until I come to get you." And she had decided that what she would do was drown herself and her son rather than see him sold to this cruel master. She returned only to learn that he would not be separated, that he would be able to stay with her. So she told Adam what she'd done, and she sent Adam, she told him where Henry was and said, "Go get him." Adam left, Adam returned without Henry. And Emily was terrified. Had somebody seen her hide her child? Had he been taken? She didn't know. But she ran as fast as she could out to this field, to this corn shock, and when she got near, she called out his name. And he came crawling out, "Hi, Mom, here I am." And she said, "You didn't answer, your father came to get you." And he said, "But you told me I was only to come out for you." And so that's what happened. As it turned out, Colonel Thompson, who they were eventually sold to, was also rather cruel. One of the things that that Nellie notes in her book is that the role of Henry as he's growing up, because his father really isn't around a lot. That as a very young child and all the way up till he's 18, he ends up having to fulfill the role not only of son but also essentially of husband. So that when his mother's having a baby, Henry is the one who goes to get the midwife and comforts his mother and so on because his father can't be there. Once they move to Meridian Hill, I think Adam can go there maybe once every couple of weeks, but it's no longer once a week. And when they move again, it goes to even less. And I'll turn you back to Jerome, and he can tell you a little bit more about the family in Ellicott Mills.
Thank you very much. Are you lost? Good. We're gonna get you lost before we end up. As Leigh has told you, Adam was brought through Riversdale from Goodwood when he was 10 years old. He, along with his two older brothers, they were separated from their parents. The girls were left at Goodwood with their parents. But he always maintained a very close relationship with his mother and his father and his sisters, even though he was separated from them from childhood. At some point in his early life, after he had gone to Riversdale, a black man had been freed from slavery in Bladensburg. He was a preacher, a Methodist itinerant preacher, and he came and spent some time on the Riversdale plantation talking to and teaching and preaching to the slaves on the plantation. And she went on and starting writing and making notes and doing these things. And in 1927, she mortgaged the family homestead for $1,000 so that she could publish her book. And when she published her book, she made sure that every household in the Plummer family, in the Arnold family, which was her mother's half-brothers and sisters, every household had a copy of that book, which we still have today. And if I talk to any member of our family, whether we've never met before or not, the first thing we ask, do you have the book? And we get our book, and we compare notes from that book about who we are. As I told Susan, I was 7 years old. My parents had separated, and my mother moved home to her mother and father, the Plumbers, Robert and Florence Plummer. And they used to tell me stories about growing up, my grandfather growing up on the Plummer compound in Prince George's County near Bladensburg. They had a 10-acre farm there, and they all worked together. My grandmother would tell me stories about growing up in another part of Bladensburg, closer to Washington, and things that happened with her family. She was the second oldest of 8 children. But I used to love those stories. And I used to love when their sisters and their brothers would come to visit, or I'd see them at church asking them questions about the Plumbers and about the Glasgows, my grandmother's family. And when I was about 7 years old, I was reading now, and I came in one day asking a whole lot of questions. And I remember my grandmother winking at my grandfather and just taking me by the hand, took me upstairs to her bedroom. Went into her bedroom and she opened her cedar chest. Ladies always had cedar chests in those days. And she opened the chest and she brought out this package wrapped in brown paper and tied in string. She carefully untied the string and opened the package, the brown paper, and a light-colored book came out of that package. It was a copy of the original Out of the Depths of the Triumph of the Cross by Nellie Arnold Plummer. That was written and published in 1927. When we found the diary in 2001 and eventually deeded it over to the Smithsonian Institution, I was the only, they wanted a copy of that book. And I was the only one. I knew the importance of giving them that book, so I gave them my book, that book that I had been reading since I was 7 years old. This is the same book that was reprinted in 1997 by Louis Henry Gates and a series on women publishers during the 1900s. And so this is my other Bible. But I have been reading this book over and over and over since I was 7 years old. And every time I open it, I find something that I may have forgotten or missed previously. But it gives me encouragement and keeps me focused on who I am and why I am. But this is what my story is. And so we, as family members, share together. But let me back up to where I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be taking you into the life of freedom after Henry has escaped when he was 17 years old from Ellicott Mills, which we now know as Ellicott City, and outside of Baltimore. And he escapes and he runs away and he is able to catch the freight train or whatever to get himself back. And he eventually finds his way back to Riversdale Plantation, where his father is still a slave. His father is able to hide him in his humble slave cabin on Riversdale Plantation until the spring of 1862. Now, the book just tells me that in April of 1862, he smuggled him into Washington, D.C. And I did not understand the significance of that until just a few years ago, when I realized that the slaves in the nation's capital were freed in April of 1862. And so he was able to get him, once he got him out of Maryland and into Washington, the boy was safe. He stayed with his aunt, his father's sister, until he was able to, as you were told in the video, to enlist in the Union Navy. And he served until the end of the war and was honorably discharged from the Navy. He served on the Coeur d'Alene gunboat. But they came home one by one. Now, as Leigh has told you, when Emily was sold in 1851, she had 5 children. My great-grandfather was 6 weeks old when he was sold in his mother's arms. There were 5 children. Sarah Miranda, the oldest one, was not sold. She had been willed in Miss Hillary's will to a niece who had died already, had previously died. And so she went to the trustee of that will. And the child was 9 years old, and he hired her out on a regular basis to work for families, and he got the pay for her working. Henry wasn't supposed to go, but the master relented and let him go with his mother. The next boy after Henry was Elias, who was 5 years old at the time. He remained at Three Sisters, and his life was destroyed because for some reason, with all the aunts and uncles that were around, nobody gave that child any attention. And he never was able to get along with his family, even when he reunited with them after the war was over and slaves were freed in Maryland in 1864. He never got along with his family. He lived into his 80s, and there was always something, a schism there that kept him from having a relationship with his family. But the others, they came together. And Margaret, who came after my great-grandfather, was born at Meridian Hill. She and Marjorie, Ellen, Marjorie died less than a year old. And then Margaret was born. And then in 1860, while they were in Ellicott Mills, the twins were born. And that comprised the family. Now Henry, as Leigh has told us, went on. He helped his sister get the church started. When she came back from New Orleans, he brought her back from New Orleans, and he helped. She told her family about a dream that she had been, a recurring dream that haunted her. And she finally began to realize that it meant that one day she would be brought back to her home, to Maryland, to bring her people to God's light. There were, in Maryland in those days, and especially in Prince George's County, there was a large influx of Catholics and Presbyterians. There were no Baptists. I don't know if there's any Baptists in here besides me today or not, but there were no Baptist congregations in Prince George's County, white or black. And she had joined a black Baptist church in New Orleans after she was freed from the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So she came back, connected with a church in Washington, D.C., in Northwest Washington, the second colored Baptist church at that time, and was trained taught by the pastor there, and she started a congregation in Bladensburg. And they've worshiped for the first few years in their father's slave cabin on Riversdale Plantation. By 1870, they moved to Bladensburg. Does anybody know where Peace Cross is? All right. This was a little tiny building they called it a rabbit gum because it was used to catch rabbits. And they used that building as their worship place until 1873 when they bought I'm supposed to turn this thing on.
Keep going.
All right. I keep forgetting. This is the church as it looked like in 1873. It had been a Presbyterian church, had been built around the turn of the century, around 1800, and had been built in another location and eventually moved to where it was moved there. And that was where they worshiped. We worshiped in that location from St. Paul Church, worshipped Baptist Church. We worshiped there from 1873 when we bought it. We sold it in 1975, 102 years later, and the church is still standing there. Not the way it looked there. It had a fire in 1907. It was heavily destroyed, but not completely destroyed, and remodeled. But the remodeled version is still there. This is fun. Henry, as Leigh has told you, loved people. He was humanitarian. He was an activist. In 1870, a former slave died in Hyattsville, and his family had no money with which to bury him. There was no such thing as insurance in those days. And so they only had one funeral home, the Francis Gash Funeral Home, of which Francis Gash was the proprietor at the time, and that funeral home is still standing today and still operating on Route 1. Mr. Gash refused to have anything to do with the final arrangements for the man because they had no money. And he had been burned so many times before by families that came with nothing. And so Henry and his father Adam promised Mr. Gash that they would be responsible for paying the bill for the funeral. And they went ahead and had the funeral. After that, Henry sat down in prayer, and he came up with a plan of action. And he came up with the idea for the Bladensburg Burying Association in June of 1870. The idea was that people would join this group, this organization, pay a membership fee to join it, pay monthly dues. And when they get sick, they could get sick benefits. When they died, their families would have some money to bury them with. That organization started in June 1870 under that guise and continued. Even with insurance companies taking over, we stayed together until the summer of 1986, 116 years later, out of Henry's dream and his vision. What happened? Okay. As Leigh has told you, in 1884, Henry was commissioned by President Chester Arthur to be the first African-American chaplain of the U.S. regular army. And President Arthur's decision was based on a recommendation letter by Frederick Douglass, as well as other prominent people in his cabinet who he trusted and believed in. This year, I've been invited to go to Texas, and I doubt if I'm going to be able to go, to participate in the 150th anniversary of the Buffalo Soldiers Association. And they want me to do a talk on Chaplain Henry Vinton Plummer. As Leigh, I don't think Leigh specified, when he went into the military, he was assigned, had 3 assignments. He was first assigned at Fort Riley in Kansas. He stayed there for a period of time, and not only was he the chaplain and responsible for the worship services and things that we do to bring people close to God, but he was also the superintendent of the school system. He was responsible for the children being educated. Why? Because Henry was the second oldest of his father's children. His father had been successful while he was visiting Emily at Three Sisters in beginning to teach his children something about reading and writing. And so Henry and Sarah Miranda had a benefit that the younger children didn't have, because by the time they were old, the younger ones, they were separated from their father on a more distant basis. But he became the superintendent of the Sunday school. He made sure that not only the children were educated, but their parents, who had been slaves and who had never had an opportunity for an education, were being educated as well. They went on from Fort Riley. They moved from the 9th Cavalry, moved from Fort Riley to Fort McKinney in Wyoming, and they were there for a period of time, and he had a fantastic reputation. And then they went from there to Fort Robinson, Nebraska. I hope, is anybody here from the West, from Nebraska? I went to Nebraska. Leigh and I went to Nebraska in 2005 researching. And we went to Fort Robinson, which is in the far northwest corner of the state of Nebraska. We flew to Kansas, but we had to drive. We drove from Kansas, from the southeast tip of Nebraska to the northwest point of Nebraska. And I promised myself I will never go back to Nebraska again. And I mean it. Leigh loves it. She grew up in Nebraska for a while. but I've had enough of Nebraska, that one trip. But it was the most exciting experience because the fort is now a museum. And those buildings are still standing. And we saw how things were operated, how they operated when he was there in from 1890 to 1894. But as Leigh told you, as you explained, he was the only black officer on the fort. As an officer, he was not allowed to socialize with the enlisted men. And because of his color, he could not socialize or mix with the officers. So he was ostracized. But he continued to do his job, and he did his best to do it well. He often got under the skin of the commanding officer because he would make recommendations and suggestions of what could be done to improve the situation on the fort. And when the commanding officer, would ignore him, he would write letters to Washington, to the Secretary of War, and to the President with those same recommendations. And they just irked those people something awful. Till finally they built up some charges and wrote up some charges to bring against him. And of course, it was at a period of time in American history when black military officers who had gone through the ranks and had earned their degrees and had earned their rank and were in good places were all being court-martialed under that idea of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. Here you see the original book in the center, Out of the Depths of the Triumphs of the Cross. And that is this book that the Smithsonian now has. On the right is the young Nellie Arnold Plummer. On the left is Nellie and her twin brother, Robert. And when Nellie wrote her book, it talks not only about the Plummer family. Robert did not want to be remembered. He was a pharmacist. He was a businessman. He had drugstores in Washington, D.C., as well as in Hyattsville. He did not want to be reminded of his humble beginnings. And so he was opposed to her writing this book. But she was a wise woman. When she finished and her book was published, she took her father's diary, she took a copy of that book, got in her horse and carriage, and drove from the house on the farm outside of Hyattsville, drove into Washington to 419 Q Street Northwest off of New Jersey Avenue. And she gave her the diary, the book, and her notes to her first cousin, Edward Arnold, who was a prominent lawyer in the early 1900s, and he was a very good friend of Carter G. Woodson. And he put those documents in the family library, and there they stayed in the family library from 1927 until that house was sold in 1962. And they bought another house on South Dakota Avenue Northeast. And the whole library, Edward was dead, all that generation was dead. And all the library was put into the attic, was stored in the attic until 1994, when another descendant who knew the importance of those documents sold that house and moved to Cheverly, Maryland. She disposed of the entire library, but she kept the diary, the book, Out of the Depths, and the notes. And she kept them. And when we found each other, I started lecturing on the Plummer family in 1988, I think it was. And in 2001, we had our first real family reunion because I had learned about Uncle Henry's plight and what he had gone through. I had learned about his court-martial. In her book, Aunt Nellie just says, she loved her brother dear. She visited him on many occasions when he was out west. She spent time with him and his family. And she talks about him throughout it was her beloved brother. But all she says about his is that in 1894, he lost his commission, period. Nothing else was said. Not being ever being in the military, I didn't know what that meant until some reenactors came and told me about his story and gave me a copy of the court-martial transcript, and I began to read it and study it. And we started working, and I found out I had to find, as a nephew, a great nephew, I could do nothing. I had to contact his immediate direct descendants. Didn't know where they were. I knew that after he left the Army, after he left Nebraska, he moved back to Kansas, and he lived in Kansas for 10 years until he died. I knew that he had 9 children altogether. His wife had eight boys and 1 girl. And I knew with 8 boys there had to be some plumbers somewhere, but didn't know how to find them. But I got a phone call one Saturday night from a cousin that I grew up with, and she lived in Hyattsville. We went to church together. We played together as children. She was my grandfather's youngest sister's grandchild. And she called and she said, "Jerome, do we have family in Kansas?" I said, "Yeah, we should." I said, "Uncle Henry died there. He left part of his family there." Well, she had been to a dinner party up in Herndon, Virginia. Her husband is from Kansas City, Kansas. And a girl that he grew up next door to was visiting, and they were at a dinner party together. And she met this girl, and a woman now, and they started talking. And so she asked my cousin, "Well, where did you grow up?" She said, "In Hyattsville." She said, "Oh, my family came from Hyattsville." And then my cousin said, "Well, my family started a church." And she said, "Well, so did my family." And my cousin said something else, and she said, "Well, so did my family." And so she decided that this woman was mocking her. So she kind of distanced herself away from her. And that when she got, and after a few days, she thought about it. And she decided to call me. I said, "What's her name?" She told me. I said, "Do you have a phone number?" She gave it to me. I said, "Goodbye." And I called Kansas. 10 o'clock on Saturday night. I called Kansas. And I said, "I am Jerome. I'm a member of the Plummer family." And I asked that proverbial question, "Do you have the book?" She said, "Yes, I have the book." I said, "Get your book." And we started going page by page and figuring out, and this was Henry Plummer's great-granddaughter. And when she found out that I was real, and not kind of joke and jive with her, and she said, "Well, give me your number. Let me call you right back. I'll call you right back." I said, "Okay." 5 minutes later, she calls back. She's called her first cousin out in Portland, Oregon, and set up a conference call, and we've talked together for the next 2 hours. And next thing I know, they are flying here to meet me and meet the family and get a sense of their family history. That was in 1997. And out of that meeting, we decided to have a reunion and bring everybody together that we could find. We were supposed to do it in 2000, but so many things happened we weren't able to do it. We did it in 2001. We had 125 family members from 13 different states. Now, that by this time, we didn't know anything about the Arnolds. My great-great-grandmothers have siblings. Didn't know anything about them. Had never really connected. But these were all plumbers. And we came together, and I told them Uncle Henry's story of what had happened to him in the military. And the family voted unanimously, giving me permission to proceed, put together a committee, and start an investigation to find out what we do, what we could do. And as Leigh told you, we started in August of 2001 with military, retired military officers, with family members, with educators, with friends, with politicians, and had no idea where we were going, what we were going to do. But we met every month, month after month after month after month. And every time we met, a little something would click together. And finally, we had it together. And we started moving. And on February 19th, I believe it was 19th, 2004, we got in the cars and we drove to Annapolis and met with Governor Ehrlich and Lieutenant Governor Steele and sat down, and they had prepared a letter of endorsement. We already had letters from city governments in Prince George's County. We had letters from the Prince George's County Council. We had their support. We had support from politicians in Nebraska as well as in Kansas. All of these were Democrats. Henry Plummer was a Republican. In 1894, all blacks were Republican because the Republican Party had saved them and brought them out of slavery. And so we contacted, and that's a whole story in itself. I can't tell that tonight because I've run out of time, how we got in touch with Governor Ehrlich. I had written a letter. Leigh and I talked about it. I'd written a letter to Governor Ehrlich, sent him some sample documents to look at, and this was in November of 2001, just a couple of months after 9/11. And it was just before Thanksgiving. And I didn't hear anything. No response came. And I questioned and I wondered what happened. And around just before Christmas, we were talking again, and she said, "You haven't heard from me?" And I said, "No." I said, "Let me call over there to the governor's office and find out what's going on." So I called, got somebody on the phone. They finally connected me with his staff member and talked with her. And she said, "Well, I never received any letter, anything from you." I said, "Well, I can send it again." She said, "Well, do that." Okay, she was really, what she was doing was making me feel good. But she realized later there had been an anthrax scare. The time that the letter arrived at the post office, the mail that comes to the governor, had been an anthrax, and so the mail had been destroyed. So when she got the letter, the new package, she immediately contacted me. And we talked. She was very cordial. She said, "I would love for you to meet the governor, but this is January. We're getting ready to start the sessions. And he's going to be tied up." And we talked back and forth, and she said, "Oh, I would love for him to hear your story and get to know you and what this, that, and the other." And so when I called Leigh and told her what the lady said, that, it was just too much with the sessions beginning and the delegation coming into session. And so Leigh called her. And Leigh talked with her. And the next thing we knew, we had an appointment for the very next day to meet with her, this young lady. And we went over there, and the office was in State Circle. Anybody know about the circle that goes around the Capitol? And I went early because I knew how difficult parking would be. And we were driving. I wanted to see where we were going, first of all, before I went to look for a parking space. So I figured out how far we had to travel. We pulled up, and the car was pulling out of a parking space. And I pulled right in. Leigh got out to see how far we were from the man's office, the woman's office. And guess what? We were right in front of her office. We had parked directly in front of her office. We went in, we met with her, and she couldn't believe us. She couldn't believe us. And we had a wonderful time. And next thing I knew, we were invited to meet the governor, meet the lieutenant governor. They gave their support. And as I said, on February 19th, we went over there. And in a meeting, we sat down together, and they both signed this letter of support and handed it to them. Our lawyers were there, members of the committee were there, and we came back, and we finalized the application for his appeal. I signed off on the application, and the next day it was delivered by hand to not only the members of the board for the correction of military records in the Army, but to senators and to congressmen and all who had supported us. Copies of that application were sent in. 5-volume application. And I got a letter back saying, "Expect to hear from us within 6 months." This was in February. 6 months came and went. Steny Hoyer had told me directly, you have any concern, give me a call. I'll find out what's going on. So I would call him, talk with him, and he would have his people to check on it. And they come back and said, well, Reverend Fowler, your committee submitted so much information, they had to go back and make sure it was all legitimate. They couldn't believe how the documents we had. We had gone to not only to the archives out here in College Park, but went downtown. And they had a whole tray, a box, with letters from Henry Plummer, the original letters, to the president, to the Secretary of War, to this person, to that person, and their responses, all in this box, just folded up. We could do what we wanted with them. We could put them in our pockets and take them home with us if we wanted to, but we wouldn't do that. We made copies and put everything back where it was. But we had all this documentation. So by October, November, I began to worry. It's taking them so long. What are they finding that they don't like? And so I started praying, because this was 2004. On February 10th, 2005, Henry Vinton Plummer would have been dead 10 years to the day. And I prayed for an answer before that, to celebrate his 100th anniversary of his death. On February 9th, 2005, I got a call saying, go home, turn on your computer. The response is coming. I went home, she said, my lawyer said, load your computer with paper. I don't know, he said, it's big. I don't know how big. 2 hours later, I heard the computer click on. My printer click on. And it ran and ran and ran 47 pages. 47-page document exonerating him and making his honorable discharge effective November 10th, 1894. And as Leigh said, then the next week, I was getting calls from the Pentagon. I'm invited over to the Pentagon to meet with officials. And what they wanted to do was exhume Uncle Henry and transfer him to Arlington National Cemetery. And when they asked me about it, my response was very simple. Thank you, but no thank you. They were shocked. So I explained to them, I said, well, first of all, he's been dead 100 years. When he died in 1905, his body was brought back from Kansas to Hyattsville, Maryland. And he was buried on the Plummer farm next to his mother in 1905. In 1911, the state passed a law that we could not bury on private property. We had to be, human remains had to be buried in a recognized cemetery. So in 1911, they had all of those graves exhumed on the farm and taken to Harmony Memorial on 4th and Rhode Island Avenue Northeast in Washington, D.C. In 1950s, they were running out of property. Now, this is 40-some years later, 50 years later, they're running out of property at that cemetery. So they decided to go back into Maryland with a larger tract of land, larger acreage. And they exhumed all of those bodies again from there and took them there. And he's actually buried in a common grave with all those that were buried one by one at Northeast. And through my experiences in life, I discovered something. When you exhume a body, you don't have to exhume the entire body. You don't have to exhume everything out of that grave site. If you get a bone, if you get a piece of the casket, that is sufficient. That's why those of you who've been around here for a while, if you remember in the 70s when they were building the subway station along Rhode Island Avenue, the newspaper kept reporting human remains being found, skulls being found, and bones being found, because they didn't have to get them. So my decision was, leave him where he is. You want to honor him, you come to where he is and honor him. So that's what they decided to do. And we were having a family reunion that year, and the family came together on July 1st for the reunion, and they came out, the Army came out, their chaplains came out, generals came out, and they paid him homage. and his flag was presented to his oldest great-granddaughter. And that's the way we want to do things. So this is what we do. Now let me just tell you, I had something else I wanted to share with you, because we're talking about, what is this? This is Tacoma. I wanted to share this with you. We've had a long relationship with people from Tacoma. Our church was founded in 1866. In 1877, under the leadership of Henry Vinton Plummer, our third pastor, he decided that we need to branch out. And so a satellite church was set up in Sitka, Maryland. Now, who knows where Sitka, Maryland is, or was? Sitka, S-I-T-K-A. Well, let me ask you a question. You know where Hillendale is? Up New Hampshire Avenue, just beyond the Beltway? That was Sitka in those days. And a church was built there, and a congregation was established, mainly with people from Tacoma Park. Being the only Baptist church in the county, a lot of folks that wanted to be Baptist came to Bladensburg and were baptized and joined the church at Bladensburg. And it says, there is a couple of, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's in the book. It says, Mills Beeman, who was baptized by Reverend John H. Brooks of Vermont Avenue Baptist Church, was married by Reverend H.V. Plummer. Brother Mills said he was baptized at the 6th Street Wharf, had to ride in his wet clothes back to the Vermont Avenue Baptist Church before changing. Mr. and Mrs. Beeman are the proud parents of Reverend Joseph N. Edward, William L. William L. married my grandfather's first cousin. I spent many days in his home, right here in Tacoma Park. Prince S. and Mary Beeman Stewart. It was also while Prince Stubbs, a member of our church, was helping at Sitka while living there that Mr. and Mrs. Mills Beeman named their son Prince Stubbs. Thomas Stewart, Isaac Adams, Mills Beemans, William Lewis, the Burrells, the Berries, and others were Sitkaites, as he called them. Sitkaites. Bladensburg Baptist Church is proud of her relation to Sitka. Reverend Hall said of Isaac Adams that he was a most consistent Christian. We built a church in Sitka. It was recognized, was set apart as a church in 1880. And 2 Sundays of the month, our pastor would have service at Bladensburg Church, would preach, and the other 2 Sundays we would have service at Sitka. So the folks from this area, from that area, from Sitka area, and from Tacoma Park would go to Bladensburg 2 Sundays of the month. And the folks from Bladensburg and Hyattsville would come to Sitka the other 2 Sundays. And that went on for 20 years until that church was set apart as a separate church in 1900. I know that much of the history from the book. But several years ago, I met the most charming young lady, whom some of you, you may or may not know, Dr. Alberta French. She grew up in Tacoma Park. When she died, she was living in Spencerville, up the road, at the end of New Hampshire Avenue. She knew the history of this community, and she shared so many beautiful things with me. That's why I'm delighted to come to you this evening and try to share with you. Now, Leigh, we have any questions to answer?
If you don't have questions, you can hit the next thing.
Questions? Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
Chaplain Plummer to serve in the Native American territory, and what it was like for his the regiment to have to do whatever they had to do.
They fought a lot of Indian
Yeah,
wars.
right.
Indian
exactly.
wars were very prevalent at the time. They fought a lot of Indian wars. And of course, he had to bury a lot of his soldiers and whatnot. But he was addicted to the military. He loved the military. He wanted to be a part. He wanted to give himself to the military. And even after he was dismissed and drummed out of the Army, he wrote back not only appealing, but when the Spanish-American Wars broke out under Theodore Roosevelt, he wanted to serve as a foot soldier, just to be there and to be a part of that development and what was going on. He was devoted completely to the military.
So it wasn't see, he wasn't upset about what the Indian Wars. I mean, where does his activism take place? That's what I don't understand.
It's, well,
Yeah.
Come on.
he's very much, one example, he's very active in the temperance movement, very, very active,
Yeah.
adamant about it, which is really interesting because he does take a drink, and that's what they get him on, really, one of the things they get him on.
So he didn't deny taking the drink. He just thought that the punishment was too.
No.
What?
But you want to know about the activism, all right, he's very big on temperance.
Yeah.
What was happening on military bases at that point, particularly at Fort Robinson, they were setting up canteens where they could serve beer and light wine, and then that would keep the soldiers on base. This was better than them going, in Fort Robinson's case, into Crawford, where they would probably pay more and find prostitutes and have to figure out how to get home after they'd been drinking and things like that. Plummer was successful in actually getting the canteen closed. The white command was livid because now the men would go into Crawford and they wanted to keep them on the base. So he did things like this all the time.
Well, was that also a racial issue that they didn't want the
No.
Black American soldiers to go into the town,
No.
or not?
No, that
It was just a temperance issue.
Yes, that was. He also, I mean, Jerome mentioned that he was a teacher, he was in charge of the school at all three bases that he was at, all three forts. And instead of just simply doing what he was supposed to do, he'd agitate all the time. He would do, when he did his monthly chaplain reports, all he did is ask for things. We need books, we need maps. He wanted more pay, he wanted for people who were teaching. He wanted all kinds of things, and all he did is keep asking for things.
And so that's the activism, that they got tired of him asking for things?
He was just a pain in the neck, really. He complained about his housing. There are different, all right, there are officers' quarters, there are enlisted men's quarters. When people move to a fort, you can't always be sure you're going to have an officer's quarters home vacant. So he ended up going into enlisted men's quarters. He complained, and they didn't want to hear about it. There were some possible racial incidents in Crawford. There was a man who had retired, and many of these former slaves, really, who went into the military. I mean, he had no family, this one who'd retired. Several of them didn't, so they would kind of stay around in the area. Well, there was one who had too much to drink, got agitated. Next thing you know, there are these flyers being distributed at Fort Robinson. The white command thought that Plummer was responsible. Plummer denied it, but they thought he was responsible. So finally, he wanted to take troops to Central Africa. He had an idea that and so he petitioned to be allowed to do that. And I think pretty soon the white command just said, enough is enough. We're tired of this guy. And they looked for a way to get rid of him. In fact, the man who brought the charges, who filed the charges against him, when Plummer first went to Fort Riley, he was in charge of the bakery. And he came in one morning and the bread wasn't baked. And the man that he'd put in charge of baking the bread was, I think, from Jamaica or someplace. Yeah.
A private.
He'd had a party. He was a private. So
And got
Plummer
drunk.
wrote him up. Now, 10 years later, guess who's at Fort Robinson? And now a sergeant. That same private. So that private is involved in this evening's incident when there's a drink taken, and it's his wife that supposedly Plummer swears at, and so on. If you read the transcript, everybody talks about this particular sergeant, Sergeant Benjamin. as not truthful, can't believe a thing he says, he's not a very nice person. Even his wife got up and testified to that. And yet they found Plummer guilty. So I think it really was, this man's a nuisance to us. We want him to remember his place, and he didn't.
He was well respected in the town of Crawford. His son graduated from the Crawford High School and was the school valedictorian the year he graduated. And I believe he was the only black in the school.
I think so. All the reports, the monthly reports that the command wrote, really, about they had to write reports on his ministry. All those were good. All those were excellent. He got choirs going, all kinds of activities.
I forget the name. I'm lost track. But the woman who started the church.
Yes,
in the
his
first-
Sarah Miranda.
How we're concentrating on Plummer,
Right.
and that's a lot of work that you've did. It's very admirable to clear his name or his reputation. And the question I have for you, was it extremely remarkable for a woman to start a church back then?
It was most remarkable.
Yeah.
Not only was she a woman, but she was 24 years old when she did this.
Yeah.
She never sought to be the pastor, but she considered herself the mother and the nurturer of her people. God had called her. She felt that God had called her to start a church. That's what she did, and she nurtured. And we have, and this is our 150th year of the church. And we have had 17 pastors, all were men. But they all worked, they lived when she lived. They worked with her, and they supported her. It was most unusual.
The story I want is Henry Vinton Plummer's wife's story. Julia Lomax had come to Prince George's County from Virginia with two brothers. They had been slaves there. And she stuck with him through all of this. And I cannot imagine what her life must have been like. I mean, if he couldn't fraternize with anybody, nor could she. She was very, very much on her own. And one of the interesting things we found in Kansas that I don't know how we'll ever track it down, but I would love to, is that at one point he's moved to Kansas. He's living in Kansas City, Kansas, and her address in the census is in Kansas City, Missouri. So I don't know whether they actually separated for a while after they moved there, whether she said enough is enough, I can't deal with this. But it also is a hotel that is her address, and it could have been that she had a job there, and that she, eventually she does get back with him, though. Yeah. And he pastors a couple of churches in Kansas City. You have a question?
Yeah, my question is pretty simple. Just anything about the Sitka Church, is it still there?
The Sitka Church experienced three drastic fires during its existence. The last fire was in the late 50s, 1950s. And at that point, they decided, forget it, and they just went their separate ways. So there is no more Sitka Church.
They used to walk there, though, from Hyattsville. I mean, that's how they got there, was walking to Sitka.
And I guess nowadays there's probably some other, I guess I've seen probably many Baptist churches throughout Montgomery County.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
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 I don't know that I have a question exactly, but just wanted to share with you that I am volunteering right now at the Anacostia Community Museum, and I'm an archivist by training. And I've had the honor and the pleasure of working on the Plummer Arnold family papers for the last month and a half. So it's
How
been
exciting.
it's been wonderful to
Yeah.
hear tonight the stories and connect them with the people that I've been seeing in the pictures and seeing the family resemblance actually in your but just I've been looking at the Plumbers, the Glasgows, the Drowns, the Baileys, the Rickers, just
Yes,
all these
yes.
these people and it's and also being able to hear more of the story of Chaplain Plummer after getting to see some of the artifacts that are there. And thank you so much. It's just been really, really wonderful to be able to have this come alive in this way.
Well, I thank all of you for being here tonight
Yeah.
and not going to sleep on us.
Questions? Well, I thank all of you for being here tonight, too, and I especially thank the two of you for being here tonight.
We did pick up a few things from
Oh, yes.
Riversdale. There's
We
the
have
Plumber
some
story and some
handouts for
other
you.
So there's
handouts, so help
there's
yourself.
handouts
Please help
there,
yourself.
and please do consider filling out our survey or taking one of the cards so you can fill it out at home online. Thank you.
If you want to take extra for friends or relatives, feel free. Thank you.
Thank you.